All right, so I bet you remember this rappel. So this is the try and accept lecture that we did earlier this year. So this is really about kind of, you don't really want to trust the user to do things. This code, however, is not great. We can do better. So let's learn to do better. Okay, so in doing better, I'm just going to grab this whole sketch, or sorry, sketch is really not the word we use anymore, and I'm just copy and pasting it into a thing called better error handling. Okay, so first things first, there are things that can go wrong before I get to this try block, right? So in this sketch, I was assuming that the input function's always going to work. And I want to illustrate something really specific, so I'm going to assume that there's maybe something that could go wrong with the input function. So I'm going to take those two kind of items, and I'm going to stick those into my try block. Oops, and I'm going to have a little formatting problem here. Because all this, oops. All right, let's see. That needs to go over, that needs to go over, that needs to go over. Stop doing that. Okay. So, that comment actually still applies, which is hilarious. Okay, so, I'm dumping my kind of earlier comments here too. Alright, so here I have the guts of my previous sketch, or my previous program. Alright, so first I'm going to try to get an answer that's going to be the result of input. Then I'm going to print it back to the user. Then I'm going to try to cast it. And then I'm going to have some kind of maybe something went wrong. Okay, so this is our kind of previous structure, and I want to show you something a little bit funky. So if I hit, please provide an integer, and I just decide I don't want to play, right? Like, okay, maybe not. Let me throw in Bill. Okay, so I said Bill, right? So that's this part ran. The print about I said Bill printed, right? And the processing please wait was part of that same line. And then we got to here, and what happened is right here when we tried to typecast to an integer, there was an error thrown. Now, what that error is, I don't actually know right off the top of my head, because what I did is I put it into this, or I put in my code an except block, and that except block works anytime an error is produced at all. Now, the thing is that any error at all will trigger this thing. For instance, if I hit Control-C to close the program, I get this keyboard interrupt thing that says, oops, something went wrong, right? So I probably don't really want that to happen. Maybe I do. That might be. But I really would like that error to be treated at the very least differently than my number didn't match kind of error. Okay, so this goes with your newfound powers to declare your own errors. So I'm not going to declare my own errors. I'm just going to show you the more advanced version of a try except block. So basically the structure of this thing is going to be that there's a try. Okay, so let me, actually I'm going to keep some of that. Okay, so the try block always gets attempted, at least, right? So it always tries. Okay. So it tries what's in here. Then in the except blocks, and I'm going to dump this old comment, and I'm going to say the except blocks, and I'm saying blocks even though there's only one, will execute on errors. Okay. And PS, this thing here, if you're typing this in VS Code, that's going to throw an error or a linter problem for you right away. it's going to tell you that it doesn't want to do that. If you want to shut the linter problem off right now, you say that we're going to accept a base exception. We're going to go into that in a second, so just bear with me on that. Okay, so that's kind of catching everything else. Then there's another block called the else block, and the else block is executed if the try block succeeds. Right, so that's if you're trying to open a file, the file's found and opens, then the else block's gonna occur. It's gonna skip all the except blocks. So the fact that this thing's called an else block is really else to the accepts. So the accept blocks are if an exception of the form, and in this case I have base exception. So if a base exception occurs, then we'll do this. Else, right, no exception occurred, then we'll do the else block. And it should be noted that the else block, I haven't tried this. I think that the else block won't, I think that the else block will execute as long as the error that occurred wasn't one of the ones that you caught with an except block. Let's check that in just a second. So the else block just looks like this, right? And it gets code in it. And for right now, I'm just going to put in, this is the else block. And really a good thing to put into an else block to start with is success, right? Print success, or print, this worked, like good try, right? Like something happened. All right, and then after the else block is what's called the finally block. And the finally block always gets executed regardless, unless the program actually crashed in the process, which it shouldn't unless you majorly screwed things up. Okay, so the finally block looks like this. It just says finally and a colon, and then we say print, and then we say something like, this is the finally block. Okay, so let me try this out quick. So if I hit run here, I'm asked to provide an integer. I'm going to say bite me. I'm going to hit Control-C. Okay, so a keyboard interrupt happened. That is a kind of base error. So it printed, oops, something went wrong. And then we got to this is the finally block. Sorry, I said base error. It's a base exception. Let me show you this kind of separate behavior. I'm not sure if you remember my picture. Hang on. Okay, if you remember the picture that I stole from this guy's blog, keyboard interrupt is a kind of base exception, but it's not a kind of exception. So if I wanted to ignore keyboard interrupts, I could, oops, that's the wrong sketch. I could in here, instead of saying base exception, just say regular exception. Now let's see if the else block actually executes here. So I'm going to do a keyboard interrupt, and it only goes into the finally block. So there was an error. It was uncaught, right? So that's what this means, that it was uncaught, because it dumped the error itself in here. If you want to pass the error along, you can do this. So you can say, let's accept the exception as E, and then we'll do, oops, how about let's spell raised right? And let me do reasonable naming schemes. Notice error is not a protected word. Okay, so if I hit go on this, I'm going to be asked to provide an integer. I'm going to give it some garbage, right? So I'm going to give it a string. Oops. I probably don't have to put it in a string, right? Because it just is a string. So I'm going to give it something that it doesn't know how to typecast. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to say, okay, so you said this, processing, right? So that's it, got through the first couple. Then it tried to typecast it, and it threw an error, right, of some kind. That some kind is an exception, so it got into this exception block. It printed out the part where it's, oops, something went wrong, and then it raised the error, but then you'll notice the finally block happened first and then the error happened. So Python's really nice. It tries to be resistant to error, so it'll keep going if it can, right? So it got past that, and then at the very end it raised the error. If I don't want to see the error, right, I can just comment this line out. And then when I hit run, I'll just get my usual oops, something went wrong. Cool. All right, so let me put in my my kind of broader thought here. So right now I just have one exception, right? Block. So I have accepting exceptions. Okay, so let me see what that error type was again. So I'm trying to provide an integer. I'm going to give it a string. It's going to give me a value error, right? So that's the error it gives me when it can't typecast. And don't be afraid to commit. Don't be afraid to get these errors out there to find out exactly what they are. Usually you have to kind of guess your way through what users might do wrong to give you all the errors so you can catch them all. In this case, it's pretty simple because there's only one thing I'm really trying to do. So either they didn't put in something that I can typecast, or they screwed up the input part, right? So I'm going to do except a, and I need this error name, right? So I'm going to accept a oops, that's not how you spell. I'm going to just accept a value error, right? And then I know what the response I want for value error is. If they put in something that's a string that can't be converted to an int, I don't want the user to see value error invalid literal for int with base 10 DSF, right? What I want to see is something like, oops, I have a caps lock problem. I'm afraid that's not a number, Dave. Right? So if I push go, it's going to ask me to provide an integer. If I give it some garbage, it's going to tell me that I'm sorry, that's not a, or I'm afraid that's not a number, Dave. Right? But if I hit run and I give her the old keyboard interrupt, it's still going to throw a keyboard interrupt error. So what okay, it's not really an error, it's an exception. Fair. Okay, so I want to account for that one too. So I'm going to say except, and I'm just going to add my base exception. Now, if you had the possibility of a bunch of different kinds of errors, like you have value errors, you have type errors, you have range errors, you have recursion errors, right? You have all these error types. And remember, there's just a ton of them, right? And you can make more if you want. You not only can you raise your own errors, you can actually define your own errors if you want to. So you can sometimes have 6 or 8 of these except blocks, each of which deals with a different error. Just make sure that the printout that goes with them goes with all the different ways that can occur, or dumps the error. If it dumps the error into the console, that's okay. It might be better to dump it into a log file. In the description for this video, I'm going to include a link to another to the Socrates gal that does a nice job with logging. Or you can use your log decorator that you made for the previous assignment if you want. Either way, it's up to you. Okay, so I've got my tries, I've got my accept value error, I've got my accept base exception, and frankly, I think the only way they can get a base exception is if they keyboard interrupt, but I'm not totally sure of that. So I'm looking at it, and there's a system exit, which I can't do on repel, and also won't matter. And there's a generator exit, which I don't think I can do on repel. So I'm going to assume the only way they can get a base exception is with a keyboard interrupt. But because I'm not totally sure, I'm going to raise the error anyway. So I'm going to accept that base exception error as, or that base exception as error. I'm going to print out an accusation that the user is a quitter and a sad face. And then I'm going to raise that error. And raising the error is going to put it back into the console, right? So I might or might not want that behavior happening. All right, let me run this. Okay, so we're going to provide an integer. Now, I know that if I give it the right thing, it'll work. So let me try that. So let me give it 4. I said 4. Processing, please wait. Okay, so that's these, right? I said 4, that's now of type integer because my typecasting worked. Then we get in the else block, then we get in the finally block. Cool. So the reason you have an else block, by the way, is if you try to open a file and you succeed, you need to close it. But if you try to open a file and you don't succeed, then you don't have to close it because there isn't a file open, right? So the try is do this thing that might generate an error. Then the accepts are if there's an error. Then the else is if the thing we tried didn't generate an error, in other words, it worked, then I might have to deal with some stuff. And then finally is usually like a, thanks for playing. Like, I appreciate you having come to my code today. Regardless of whether it worked for you, I would like you to take this survey. Please like and subscribe or whatever. Like, comment, and subscribe. Whatever garbage that she does. But let me try this with the keyboard interrupt. So I give it a keyboard interrupt. I get my statement for keyboard interrupts, right? And then I get the finally block, and then I get the error message, right? Because I actually raised that on purpose, right? Now, instead of raising it, you probably want to log it. And really, really briefly, you can either use your decorator, which is way harder, or you can use the logger module. So maybe this video is long enough. So I'll let you watch Socrates' video for that, and if you have any questions, hit me up on how to use a logger.